Emma Lundberg is a doctoral student in the Nelson Institute and is doing her PhD on inland fisheries, particularly conflicts over management of natural resources. And what's interesting about Emma and her advisor Carolyn is that, among other things, they they have a unique blend of skills and approaches that is as broad as you can imagine, from population genetics to rhetoric. So you paint or sing? Because if you had like a form,
the saxophone.
Really play the saxophone. There we go. All the way from the hard sciences to the art, performing arts. So there we go. So what Emma does, and she'll explain better than I, is to connect theories and methods from science and technology studies with social science research methods, and connect that to broad concepts about the ecology of streams. So with a grant from the Global Health Institute, Emma has been able to expand upon this theme and ask the question, what is a healthy stream? Which she's going to answer definitively for us.
Thank you so much, Tony, and thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk here at the Global Health Tuesday seminar. And so I do have a script, but I may kind of bounce back and forth between using it or not. And I am really happy to be here to talk about streams and people. Hi guys! And I'm grateful for the opportunity to share some of our ongoing work into the social and ecological aspects of stream health, restoration, and management in Wisconsin that we've really been able to kickstart because of funding from the Global Health Institute. As many of you know, I came here in 2018 to work with my advisor, Caroline Truschke, back there. So a lot of this work builds from research we started in New England based in the restoration of New England streams, fish migration, and conflicts over natural resources. So I see my work as being really grounded in what is needed and practical for freshwater management. And in my presentation tonight, I'll describe some of this ongoing work in the Driftless area and in Marinette County that's broadly intervening in stream health. But before we dive into the stream health, I really want to take a moment to acknowledge that we're standing on Ho-Chunk land, which stretches from the Mississippi toward Green Bay and south into Illinois. As someone who has attended universities in multiple states and lived in a number more, I help to maintain the settlement culture that has made land displacements possible. Because of this, I feel that my role in this structure is something I need to acknowledge. So, I just want to take a moment and thank you. Like all other global health issues, stream management and restoration is a complex, site-specific situation that requires the intersection of many different disciplines. My talk tonight has 3 parts. First, I attempt to get us all on the same page in terms of stream health and the ways that we can assess this. I then briefly describe 2 ongoing projects in Wisconsin, the Driftless Restoration Project we're working on, and also stream movement in Marinette County to the northeast of here. The final part of my presentation will be focused on describing the practical application and importance of interdisciplinary work and thought. So, what is a healthy stream? In my opinion, this question really isn't as simple as it sounds, and neither is assessing it. Some streams, like this one, are deep and narrow with grassy-lined, spongy floodplains. Others are rocky, clear, cold, and run through old-growth hardwoods. Some have been restored with trees removed, native or non-native cold-weather grasses planted, and banks restabilized. There are rivers that rage through deep ravines or canyons, are fed by snowmelts or glacial mountain lakes, groundwater or precipitation-based, sometimes both.
These are all from the Marinette area?
No, they're not. They're actually some of my favorite streams from across the U.S.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Whoops. With varying amounts of woody habitat sourced from surrounding forests or maybe placed by restoration practitioners. Each of these streams, while clearly not representing the entire diversity of streams, like I said, these are just a few of my favorite streams. Some of them are from Wisconsin. This is Oyster Creek. This is also a favorite in the back there. But it demonstrates that each stream is unique with particular flow regimes, surrounding land uses, and physical, chemical, and biological markers of what is health. Rivers are complex and dynamic systems. Land use cover management, geology, soil type, climate, topography, and hydrology, all intersect and shape particular ecosystems and the way that nutrients, sediments, and organisms, and so on, move through these systems. Essentially, what this means is that the health of a stream is a reflection of the health of the land and the ability of natural processes and cycles to function. Globally, many rivers across the world are experiencing declining water quality. For example, in the US, there are approximately 1/3 of freshwater bodies that are classified as polluted. Because of this enormous issue and the fact that we all rely on water for life, for food, and more, there is an urgent need to address stream health that repairs not only the degradation, but also shifts the relationships that we have to water that allowed for degradation to occur in the first place. And this is where I see my responsibility and my intervention coming through in my research. So how can we understand the health of a stream? There are many ways to assess the ecological health or ecological integrity, or to pass judgments about the status and or value of a system. However, there are 3 primary categories these assessments fit into: the physical, chemical, and biological. When we're thinking about stream health, we look to in-stream characteristics and processes, but we also look beyond the channel into watersheds. And even more, we think about connectivity and movement of species as a means to assess the health of riverine systems. I'll briefly walk through some of the common physical, chemical, and biological tools that are used to assess health, and then I'll provide some context for why they're important. Physical stream assessments rely on measurements of the material stream to understand the health of that particular system. Common variables to measure include stream bed sediments, in-stream habitat, riparian vegetation, and the disturbance regimes. And so these are particularly important factors that help determine how healthy a stream is. Habitat is a product of interactions between the flow of that system, inputs like woody material, and in-stream and stream bank vegetation. Habitat assessments are often done to examine the quality of a stream for particular species and specific needs. Sediment is also a really important factor for reproduction, for life history, histories of organisms, and is constantly in flux. For example, brook trout, which are native to Wisconsin and are considered an indicator of stream health, often require cool, clear water and coarse gravels to reproduce. Sedimentation and suspended sediment in the water column, which is also turbidity, is a huge water quality concern. Lots of sediment that comes into the water from erosion can smother or scour habitats and aquatic organisms and can decrease the light penetration, which then may impact the base productivity of a system. Temperature is also a very common variable for monitoring stream health, largely because temperature is one of the biggest limiting factors for a lot of aquatic organisms. Arguably, one of the most important characteristics to monitor and understand is flow, which is often considered the master variable, which is one of my favorite ways to refer to any kind of variable. I just think it's funny. And flow, because it is this master variable, it shapes habitats, and it can be altered either through natural or human-induced ways, and it has a drastic effect on the aquatic ecosystem. And one example is through flooding. And so this photo came from one of our study sites, and so there was a huge flood that happened in 2018 that it was a historic flood, and it took out a beaver dam that was at the confluence of Tainter Creek and Conway Creek. And so as you can see, it kind of just moved this entire mass of sediment from there, and there was a huge amount of sediment that was behind that dam as well. And so the old beaver dam that previously held back a large amount of sediment, when it broke, was swept downstream into Tainter Creek and beyond. The drastic change in flow with the flood caused changes in habitat, sediment, and erosion, which then likely impacted the organisms that live in that system. And although flooding and erosion can often be thought of as bad or dangerous, these events are part of the way that a natural ecosystem functions. Floods can change and shape habitats in very nuanced ways. But it's important to recognize that under a changing climate, storms and rain events are predicted to intensify, and streams with poor land use that are incised, which means that the bed of the stream is really low and the banks are really high.
Where is this in the Driftless area?
So this is, do you know where Star Valley is?
Yeah, up in Sauk County, I think.
No. Do you know Soldiers Grove?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it's out in that region.
On
of
the
the
Kickapoo
Driftless area.
base.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yes, sir. And so when you have these tall incised channels, you end up having increased flash flood events. So what that means is that water goes through the channel and it doesn't reach the floodplain, so the energy isn't allowed to dissipate and slow the flow and reduce the impact of that flood event. So that's one reason why floods in the Driftless area are so catastrophic. And as we all know, floods have both ecological and social impacts. In recent decades, the Driftless has witnessed multiple catastrophic flood events, but notably the 2007 flood, often talked about in local communities and used as a reference point for contemporary storm events, caused over $50 million in damage. In 2018, the flood was even worse and broke records across the Driftless region, to the tune of $108 million in residential damage and $75 million in public infrastructure damage. And in just Vernon County alone, 350 people had to be rescued from the floodwaters. So how do we engage with a landscape that has witnessed increased rainfall and storm severity, causing increased problems with regional flooding, and is predicted to worsen under a changing and intensifying climate? Some people argue that we need to find ways to retain soil and improve water infiltration, prevent soil erosion, and restore the health of waterways. I also think we need to think across disciplinary boundaries, particularly in the ways that we purposely engage with landscapes, whether it's for recreation, development, agriculture, or any other competing demand on driftless streams. Because what we do on the landscape shapes the health of the systems that we rely on. So the next way that we assess systems is through chemical assessment. So when it comes to chemical assessment, we're often looking for potential contaminants. We measure dissolved oxygen concentrations, pH, and the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen in the water. Thinking about contaminants, we often look for things like heavy metals, organic pollutants, nutrients, and pathogens, all of which may be attached to sediments that enter the river system through erosion and flooding and poor land use practices. And so that makes land use practices particularly important for the aquatic and chemical health of the streams. Dissolved oxygen is influenced by the water temperature, so colder water will hold more oxygen, whereas warmer water holds less oxygen. And stream velocity and in-stream vegetation also influences this dissolved oxygen content in a water system. The pH level of a river depends on numerous internal and external factors. Notably, the rocks and soils within the watershed produce a particular pH, but activities like coal mining, which produce sulfuric acid, can initiate shifts in the pH, which may be life-threatening for certain species with a narrow tolerance. And finally, forms of nitrogen and phosphorus, which are necessary for stream internal growth, in excess can lead to eutrophication. These nutrients are used in most fertilizers, may come from sewage, and their excess may increase algal growth, also causing a slew of other health concerns for both humans and non-humans. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that the chemical components of a water body can tell us about how the landscape is used and can give us insight into some of the less visible indicators of stream health that we would be able to see with only physical or biological assessments. So this is a lot of organisms, and potentially one of the most common ways that streams are assessed is through biological assessment. And So when you're thinking about biological assessments, they're typically done in terms of fish, macroinvertebrates, and plant species. And so depending on the species composition, you can assess how healthy a stream system is. And you can learn a lot about that system and the water that flows through the landscape. So if you have, say, stoneflies and mayflies and brook trout, those are all indicators of what would be considered good water quality. So you would typically think that you have cooler water temperatures, higher dissolved oxygen, and in a less impaired landscape. Whereas if you had species that were a lot more tolerant to low oxygen levels, like leeches or something like that, you could say that you might have an impaired water system. But depending on the composition of the species and the abundance of those particular species, you can learn a lot about how healthy a system is. And so essentially the biological condition of a water body is often considered the ultimate indicator of watershed health, as aquatic organisms and communities reflect the cumulative conditions of all other watershed components and processes. This means that changes in environmental conditions will lead to changes in the biological community. So one example that I'm going to go over really quickly is about gill lice. And so this example comes from Matt Mitro, who's in the back. He could probably answer questions later if anyone is interested. So his research suggests that organisms like gill lice may be responding to changes in environmental conditions. Gill lice, which are ectoparasitic copepods, attached to the gill filaments, fins, and or the body of brook trout, and only brook trout, as part of fulfilling their life cycle. And so they're native to Wisconsin streams, and although they might be a little gross looking, they're a natural part of ecosystems here in Wisconsin. And so due to a changing climate and environmental conditions that may favor gill lice, infection has the potential to intensify, particularly if fish are stressed, with weakened immune systems, and in relative drought conditions, with increased competition with introduced trout species in low summer flow conditions. So there's a lot of factors to consider, but essentially what I'm saying is that because of the environmental conditions that are there, you may have shifts and differences that occur within the aquatic populations, and that can tell you something about how communities are reacting and how healthy they are in those particular conditions. And so I'll just briefly go through these pictures. And so this is actually a brown trout, so it's not a brook trout, and I realized when I was looking for pictures for this slide that I didn't have a picture of brook trout without gill lice. I don't know if you can see with the light very well, but there's no sort of white inflammation. They're very vibrant and red gills right here. In this one, you have that white tissue right there would indicate a mild or early infection. And then in some streams, you'll find a severe infection where the gills will be loaded with these different parasites. And so they look like a little ball with two little legs that attach to the gill or to the fins. And they're not just affecting adult individuals, but they're also attaching to the gill plates and fins and bodies of juvenile fish, which has an impact on the recruitment and the abundance of fish in streams and may lead to mortality if fish are unable to come back from an infection like that when flows increase and temperatures are better and everything like that. But what does this mean for stream health? And so what I'm saying is that if we're aware of the environmental shifts that cause these drastic changes in the health of native indicator species, which would be brook trout in Wisconsin, we may be able to refine stream management and restoration practices that accommodate a lot of these concerns, or we could at least try to. Thinking about stream health, we're often also thinking about how to best repair it. Stream restoration has been on an upward trend globally for the last few decades. A few key themes that restoration must include are that restoration must include both social and ecological factors, The success of restoration projects is often improved with greater inclusion of local stakeholder perspectives and needs. And to adequately restore an aquatic ecosystem, we must restore the natural hydrology. And even though habitat is a central focus of restoration projects, restoring natural processes over structural fixes will offer more sustainable solutions. And something that's really common across restoration projects is this idea of connectivity. And so I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about what connectivity is and then how it impacts streams. So, as I said, restoration is largely focused on repairing connectivity. And this is such a big deal because there are over 800,000 dams across the world. And dams, they fragment ecosystems, and they limit the movement of species and nutrients and sediment, and they also can cause issues for communities that rely on river sources. And approximately 80% of large rivers in the global north are impacted by damming practices, and over 80,000 dams in the US are identified, but this number is probably underestimated because of when the National Inventory of Dams did an assessment, they used dam height and storage capacity as a limiting factor to figure out how many dams were there. So there are smaller dams that hold less water. They're just not accounted for in the database. The intensity and extent of damming practices have had enormous impacts on aquatic ecosystems. This doesn't even touch the massive impact of culverts at road crossings that limit the movement of organisms, some of which require extensive movements to fulfill their life history requirements. So those are river herring, and this video was taken in Rhode Island when I was working on a different project, and we were tracking river herring through a series of restoration projects. So there were some full dam removals, there were a few improvements on fish ladders, and then there were nature-like fishways that were put in place. And so we used tagging equipment to monitor the movement of these fish that spawn in freshwater, migrate out to the ocean, and then come back within 3 to 5 years to repeat the cycle. And when these fish run into the base of a dam, like they did in this case, they'll just spend days swimming around the base of a dam, and then they'll just go back out to the ocean. And the reason I showed that video is because sometimes I feel like it's hard to conceptualize what these organisms are doing if they are faced with a barrier like that. And so you can read about it, but if you see it, you realize that there's a lot more to it than fish that don't get to spawn. There's a whole system that doesn't get to receive the nutrients that the fish bring in from the ocean, and then you have the impact of lower populations of fish that we're trying to restore actively in a lot of different rivers. And because of these issues, primarily with human health and safety, there's been a lot of dam breaches. We had a few in Wisconsin recently. And for a lot of fish passage reasons, over 1,400 dams have been removed since the 1970s.
So these fish can live both in salt water and
Yes, sir.
fresh water?
They can. So they actually need both types of water at different parts of their life. And so I briefly wanted to bring up this kind of counterintuitive idea. And so we have a lot of restoration projects that are really aimed at restoring connectivity, but there's also this big push in restoration discussions about restoring beaver, which are semi-aquatic rodents that have a life of systematic dam building across all across the United States. And this idea of the river discontinuum is the idea that when we're restoring ecosystems, we're not necessarily thinking about ecosystems that were previously disconnected. So when European settlers came to the US and began a movement, there were beaver everywhere. So rivers were dammed all over. And so you have these complex systems of wetlands and river and wetland and huge floodplains. And so a lot of this complexity has been lost with the removal of beaver, with the removal of wetlands, and all of this has had an impact on flooding and on health, both human and non-human. And so when we're thinking about how do we restore an ecosystem, we often have to think about a reference point. And the reference point isn't always the best reference point if you're only considering free-flowing condition. And so part of the work that I hope to contribute to is thinking about connectivity in a more nuanced way, because I think that a lot of the same logic that went into damming a lot of these systems for the power mills and sawmills, things like that, is the same logic that's bringing about the consistent removal of dams, which I'm not saying we shouldn't be removing a lot of dams, but I do think we need to think about how systems are patchy and diverse. And so there's been this push in restoration to restore beaver, and that's because beaver dams and beaver dam analogs, which are essentially human-made beaver dams, are increasingly used to accelerate the recovery of channel incision, which I talked about earlier as being an issue with the stream bed being really low and the banks being really high, and that's largely a product of poor farming practices in the Driftless area specifically, which created an accumulation of what's called post-settlement alluvium, where you have the stream bed that's really low, and it's cut down through a lot of soil that's been deposited in valley beds. And so beaver are increasingly being used to accelerate the recovery of incised channels, which also aids in the recovery of hydrology, of the thermal regime in the river, and the geomorphic and riparian vegetation, all of which must be considered when you're assessing the health of a stream. So I know I just threw a lot of stuff at you guys, and some of it may have been confusing, and yeah, I just want to point out a few key points. That stream health is really messy, it's complex, and it requires thinking about a lot of different things from a lot of different points of view. And so it's not just thinking about the ecological condition, but you're also thinking about the social condition. And stream health is a combination of what's in the stream, what's going on in the channel, and it's also what's going on in the watershed, on the landscape, what are you using it for, and what's going into the stream. And in order to fully understand the health of the stream, we need to think about the different parameters that we're using to assess it, and the chemical, the physical, and the biological, in order to get a better image of what's actually happening in the stream and on the landscape. And even though restoration is often used as a tool to restore the health of a stream, restoration practices are often uncertain, and they require nuance and site specificity, which is also the same for health in a lot of cases. So I'm briefly going to talk about two of the ongoing projects we have. And so the first one I'm going to talk about is the project we have with the Driftless stream restoration. So the study region is in the Driftless area. It's an unglaciated landscape. The land use shapes the stream health. So as I talked about with agricultural practices, with the post-settlement alluvium that is built up in the stream beds, and a lot of the farming that goes on and the nutrients that go into that system. And so there's been a big push with the Trout Unlimited Driftless Area Restoration effort to actively work on restoring these streams. And what's kind of come up with these discussions is that there are some uncertainties about the best practices to use, particularly thinking about climate change conditions. But what's really important about the Driftless area is that it's not only this hub of restoration in Wisconsin, but it's also an area that has an enormous economy built around recreational fishing. So there's approximately 6,500 jobs and $1.6 billion brought in annually because of this enormous resource that we have in Wisconsin. So this project, which is part of the Kickapoo Buffer project that I work on with my advisor, Caroline, We do both biophysical and social inquiry. So we use a combination of habitat assessments, geomorphic assessments, and semi-structured interviews. And we're doing some community workshops starting next week that I'm really excited about. And so this is a restoration project that happened in Tanger Creek, near where that Beaver Dam is, or was. It was right here at the confluence. So as you can see, the stream was restored, and what they did here was they sloped back the banks and armored in some places, replanted cool weather grasses, and then put in some woody material for habitat. So typically in the Driftless, as I was just explaining, there's some really common methods that they use to restore streams. So over here we have a velocity weir, bank armoring. As you can see, it's nice you can see it, but often you don't see it because there's dirt on it. There's supposed to be dirt. But there was a big flood that washed out all of the dirt that they had put on in the seeds, the native seeds, which was a bummer. But yeah, so this is pretty much rock piles along the bank to stabilize it. It's not necessarily the most natural thing, but it does have a particular use. And this is a root wad that was put into the stream. So they'll put the tree into the bank, and then you'll just have the root wad sticking out, and it creates this pooled habitat. And then over here, this is some of the large rock that's used for bank stabilization on some of the streams. So this rock is a lot smaller, but depending on what's going on with the site, what they're doing, they'll use these different sizes. And so this is the creation from David Trano in Wisconsin. It's the Lunker structure, which essentially replicates an undercut bank. So you'll have undercut bank is like you have all of the soil on top and roots and everything, and then the bank goes underneath, and it is a great habitat for aquatic organisms, but that's supposed to replicate that. But some of the issues that have come up with these is that it locks systems into place where streams are naturally dynamic and the sediments move, and there's a lot of change that occurs. So what's the best way to think about maintaining the dynamics of a stream while also allowing the stream enough time to recover? So that's kind of an issue that's come up a lot. In this research, we kind of have three main questions that I've been working on. And what is the best management practices for restoring driftless area streams? Do socially constructed arguments about restoration practices in the driftless region separate into distinct groups? And if there are distinct groups, what are the groups and how do they compare to traditional stakeholder divisions? So this is a lot of the social science work that I've been working on. And kind of a really brief, non-in-depth overview of what we found is essentially lining up with a lot of what comes out of the literature anyway, which is that there are these different perspectives that come up. There are people that are really focused on habitat. What can we do to improve habitat, to improve trout fishing? How can we get the biggest fish? What do we have to do to improve the habitat? And then, there's also work that's being done for non-game species. So there's hibernaculums that get put into rocks and things for turtles and whatnot. And then there's a group that's really focused on hydrology. How can we restore the natural hydrology that occurred at this stream? And then geomorphology, and then a watershed perspective. And we've been finding that there's this debate about riparian vegetation, and there's this issue of scale. What scale should restoration projects be at, and who should these restoration projects be for? And so this debate over vegetation, this is also a restored stream, and as you can see, there's not really many trees along the banks there. So one of these debates is, should we have these treed systems, or should we have more grassy systems? And it depends where you are regionally, really. If I were to tell people in New England that they should take trees off the banks, I think they would be very mad at me. But if I were to go to the Driftless and tell them you need to plant trees along all of your streams, I think I would have the same reaction. So it's very specific to the region, what was there before, and what are you trying to restore a system to? And that's kind of what we've been finding there. The other project that I'll briefly touch on is the trout movement that we're doing in Marinette County. So the study region is up in northeast Wisconsin. The region has long, harsh winters, and there's a significant warming trend in that area for temperature. Historically, that area has witnessed a lot of extensive beaver control. That's where a lot of historic beaver research was done, that much of the state management programs are based off of. So it's a really great region to think about movement and connectivity and this issue of what is the best form of connectivity and how can we make that a little more nuanced. And so there's a little uncertainty in exactly how fish are moving through these systems and at what time. And so a lot of the work that I do with Matt is thinking about fish movement in the winter and where do fish go and when do they come back. So we're asking, what are the winter conditions in this area? So what are the temperatures? And then what are the movement behaviors of both brook trout and brown trout, because they're both within that area? And what are the variables that influence movement behavior? And so these are just some of the stream sites we have there. And as you can tell, they're pretty brushy, some of them. There's a lot of tag alder, and it gets a little messy sometimes. And so just really briefly, we use two different types of techniques for monitoring the movement of fish right now. We use what's called a passive integrated transponder tag and a visible implant elastomer. And so a pit tag is small, as you can see here, and it's injected into the body cavity of the fish. There's typically an incision here. You put it in the fish, and the tag doesn't have a battery. And if the fish moves through either our reader wand or an antenna that we're going to put out, then the tag is activated and you get a ping of this fish was here at this time. And this visible implant elastomer is used on the fin, so it's a sort of rubbery material that hardens in the fin, and you can visibly see it, and it kind of, you're giving yourself a safety by using multiple tagging methods too, because if you lose one of the pit tags, if it falls out of the body cavity of the fish is still marked, so at least you know that you've seen this fish before, and you can record it as such. So, but what are the management implications for that? Well, it's important to know the habitat preferences of individual species, what the movement patterns are, and as I've been talking about, it's really important to think about how we can nuance this idea of connectivity and fragmentation within river systems. And in the context of climate change, future management needs to keep working toward accounting for what the conditions are going to be. We can't continue to manage in one particular way if the ecology of a system is changing, and if the land use is changing, and the demands that are competing on the landscape are moving one direction or the other. So that's really why we need to understand what fish require at certain times of the year so that we can improve the way that we interact and engage with river systems. So kind of the last point that I want to make is, what can we learn from stream management, or what can stream management learn from interdisciplinarity? And as someone who would say that they're an interdisciplinary scientist, I would say that for me, one of the biggest contributions that interdisciplinary science can bring to the table is that it allows you to think across boundaries, which is really important. So you're not just thinking about stream ecology, you're also thinking about, well, what are the people doing on the landscape? What are their opinions? Because opinions and values are something that shape the way we manage a stream, and it shapes the ecology of a particular system. And so not only recognizing that humans have an impact and are included within an ecological system, but also recognizing that there are competing demands, there are competing ecologies and economies, and different landowners will want to do different things on their land, and how can we engage differently. And I think that by taking interdisciplinary approach, we can really try to do something that's innovative and works within communities and structures that are already in place. So I just briefly want to acknowledge that I did not do any of this work alone. I don't think anyone does research by themselves. I've had a ton of help from my advisor and Eric Booth, who really taught me a lot and showed me everything out in the Driftless, and Matt Mitro with Wisconsin DNR, who I would not be able to do the work I do without. And then the Wisconsin Trout crew and some folks from APHIS that were kind enough to take me out and show me what Beaver management is all about, which was a great experience. And then I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk here today at the Global Health Seminar and be part of Nelson and work within science and technology studies. And I'm grateful you're all here today. So thank you.